Welcome back. Today we're diving into a really tough but absolutely critical area of criminal law, the insanity defense. We're going to zero in on one single word that can make all the difference in a murder case, the word wrong.
Right.
Our goal here, as always, is to give you a clear path through some complex legal thinking. We're looking at the crucial difference between knowing something is legally wrong versus morally wrong. Think about this. Someone commits a terrible act, they even know they'll be arrested, but they honestly believe truly that God commanded them to do it. Are they guilty? Or are they legally insane? That's the exact problem the New York courts faced back in 1915 in a landmark case, People v. Schmidt.
It really is a fascinating clash, isn't it? A moral paradox wrapped in a legal question. And the answer hinges completely on how the law interprets that one word wrong within the insanity statute. So, our plan is this. First, we'll lay out the basic statutory rule as it stood, the black letter law. Then we'll use that famous Schmidt case with Justice Cardozo's reasoning to see how that initial, maybe rigid interpretation got challenged and, well, expanded. We'll break it down step by step using that legal analysis structure.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's start with that foundation then. What was the actual legal rule for insanity in New York at the time? What did the statute say someone had to prove to be excused?
Right. So the New York Penal Law, Section 1120 back then, set out the rule. It said a person isn't excused from criminal liability unless they were suffering from a defective reason. And that defective reason had to result in one of two specific conditions. It's an either-or situation.
The conditions, what were they?
The first condition, element one, was that the defect meant they did not know the nature and quality of the act they were doing, like physically what was happening. Or, element two, the defect meant they did not know that the act was wrong.
Got it. So either they didn't understand the physical reality of their action or they didn't understand it was wrong. Only need one. Now, let's bring in People v. Schmidt to see how this plays out. First, what are the legally dispositive facts? What happened that brought this issue to the forefront?
Well, the facts are quite disturbing, frankly. The defendant, Schmidt, he confessed to killing a woman named Anna Almuller. Her dismembered body was found in the Hudson River. He admitted he cut her throat, but, and this is the core of it, he claimed he wasn't acting out of malice. He said he was driven by an insane delusion. He believed he heard the voice of God commanding him to kill her as a sacrifice, an atonement for his past life, which he described as full of unspeakable excesses. So his defense wasn't, I didn't do it. It was, I did it because God, through my delusion, told me to. The jury, however, found him guilty.
Right, that's a stark contrast. Confession on one hand, divine command delusion on the other. So when it went up on appeal, what was the precise legal issue the higher court had to decide?
The core legal question was squarely about element 2 of the statute, not to know the act was wrong. Did wrong have to mean only legal wrong, like knowing it's against the laws of New York? Or could wrong also encompass moral wrong, especially when the person's sense of morality was completely warped by an insane delusion, like believing God commanded the act?
Okay, that's the heart of it. What rule of law did the Court of Appeals apply? You mentioned the statute, Penal Law, Section 1120. Can you state it again and break down those elements clearly?
Yes, the court applied Penal Law, Section 1122. As we said, it has those two alternative excusing elements stemming from a defective reason. Element 1, not knowing the nature and quality of the act. Element 2, or not knowing the act was wrong. And the entire fight in Schmidt really centered on the meaning and scope of that second element, the wrong part.
Thank you. Now for the court's elemental analysis. Let's walk through this carefully. How did the court deal with the first element, asking if Schmidt knew the nature and quality of his act?
Well, applying that first element was relatively straightforward, actually. The evidence showed Schmidt absolutely knew the physical nature of what he was doing. I mean, he knew he had a knife. He knew he was cutting a human throat. He wasn't, say, under the delusion he was peeling fruit. He just attached a delusional meaning or purpose to that physical act sacrifice. So because he understood the physical act itself, the court concluded element 1 was not met. He couldn't use that path for the insanity defense.
Okay, so path 1 was closed off. He knew the physical act. That means everything hinges on element 2, not knowing the act was wrong. How did the trial court initially handle this? This is where the definition became critical, right?
Yeah, exactly. The trial judge took a very narrow approach. In his instructions to the jury, he defined wrong specifically and only as contrary to the law of the state. He basically told the jury, look, even if Schmidt thought God told him to do it, if he also knew that murder was against New York law, then the insanity defense fails, period. Schmidt clearly knew murder was illegal. He even tried to hide the body initially. So under that strict legal wrong definition, the jury had little choice but to convict.
That seems quite restrictive. If someone knows an act is illegal, that's it, even if their entire moral compass is shattered by delusion. Why did the Court of Appeals, specifically Justice Cardozo, find that interpretation problematic?
That's precisely the point Cardozo attacked. He found that narrow construction just unacceptable. He looked at the history of the insanity defense, noting that, way back, madmen weren't even tried. They needed a king's pardon. He argued that limiting wrong solely to legal wrong just strains the word's natural, broader meaning. He famously wrote that such a narrow reading would rob the rule of its essence. Yes, it's a very stark and visceral example. Cardozo asks us to imagine a mother, someone described as devotedly attached to her baby. But under the influence of an insane delusion, she comes to believe that God has commanded her to kill the child as a sacrifice. Importantly, Cardozo specifies, she knows the law forbids killing her child. She knows it's legally wrong.
Okay, so she knows it's illegal but believes God commands it. How does Cardozo use this scenario to test the definitions of wrong?
He uses it to show the absurdity, in his view, of the purely legal definition. If wrong only means legal wrong, then this mother, despite her profound delusion and her belief in a divine mandate, would be guilty of murder simply because she knew the act was illegal. Cardozo essentially says finding her criminally responsible under those circumstances would be a mockery of justice. No jury, he implies, acting reasonably would convict her. The hypothetical powerfully argues that true mental capacity, true culpability, isn't just about knowing the law books. It's about the ability to grasp the moral wrongness of an act. And if an insane delusion completely obliterates that moral understanding, replacing it with a perceived divine duty, then knowledge of the law alone shouldn't be enough to convict.
That really clarifies the policy concern. They didn't want the law applied in a way that felt fundamentally unjust given the defendant's mental state.
So after this analysis, what was the Court of Appeals' final conclusion on the meaning of wrong in the insanity statute? The court held that, yes, there are indeed times and circumstances, like those involving profound, insane delusions about morality, where the word wrong in the statute ought not to be limited to legal wrong. They didn't definitively say Schmidt was insane, but they said the question of whether his delusion prevented him from understanding the moral wrongness of his act, even if he knew it was illegal, should have gone to the jury. So they reversed Schmidt's conviction and ordered a new trial where the jury would be instructed on this broader understanding of wrong, incorporating the possibility of moral delusion.
So the ruling basically carved out an exception. Knowledge of illegality isn't the end of the story. If a specific type of delusion, one convincing the person the act is morally right, is present.
That's a good way to put it. It established that knowing the act is illegal doesn't automatically defeat the insanity defense if the reason the defendant committed the act was an insane delusion overriding their moral understanding.
This is incredibly important for understanding how the insanity defense actually works in practice, especially in these difficult delusion cases. Okay, let's synthesize this for someone facing exam question or trying to apply this. Can you give us that actionable, step-by-step diagnostic checklist based on the statute and the Schmidt ruling?
Absolutely. If you're analyzing a potential insanity defense under this New York standard, here's a structured approach. Step 1. Identify the defective reason. First, you have to spot evidence of a relevant defective reason, serious mental illness, delusion, etc., existing at the time the act was committed. Step 2. Check element 1, nature and quality. Ask, did this defect prevent the defendant from knowing the physical nature or quality of their act? For example, did they think they were cutting a loaf of bread when it was actually a person? If yes, the defense applies. Stop here. If no, proceed to step 3. Step 3, check element 2, wrongness, nested analysis. This is the crucial part involving Schmidt. Ask, did the defect prevent the defendant from knowing the act was wrong? This needs 2 substeps. Substep 3A, legal wrong. Did the defendant know the act was against the law? Illegal. If no, the defense likely applies. If yes, they did know it was illegal, you must go to the next substep.
Okay, so if they knew it was illegal, we then apply the Schmidt exception.
Exactly. Substep 3B, moral wrong exception Schmidt. If the answer to 3A was yes, they knew it was illegal, now you ask, was that knowledge of illegality rendered irrelevant or meaningless because of an insane delusion that convinced the defendant the act was morally justified or commanded, like by God? If the evidence suggests such a delusion existed and genuinely overrode their understanding of moral wrongness, then the defense can still apply under Schmidt even though they knew the act was illegal. Step 4, conclusion. So to summarize the conclusion, the insanity defense applies if the defect of reason meant the defendant didn't know the nature quality of the act, element 1, or if they didn't know it was legally wrong, element 2, substep 3a, or critically, even if they knew it was legally wrong, an insane delusion convinced them it was morally right. Schmidt exception, element 2, substep 3b.
That's a fantastic breakdown. It really clarifies how Schmidt adds that crucial layer concerning moral understanding warped by delusion. It's not just about knowing the law books. It's amazing how focusing on the interpretation of just one word wrong forced the legal system to grapple with the very nature of culpability and mental illness. Cardozo really puts the boundary there.
He certainly did. It shows how the law sometimes has to evolve its definitions to meet, well, deeper policy goals. In this case, the goal was to ensure that criminal responsibility aligns with a person's actual capacity for moral understanding, not just their awareness of statutes, especially when severe mental illness is involved.
Yeah, the law couldn't just stick to a rigid definition if it led to outcomes that seemed fundamentally unjust, or as Cardozo put it, a mockery.
Precisely. It highlights that legal definitions, especially in complex areas like criminal intent and mental states, are often tools designed to achieve a certain kind of justice, and sometimes those tools need refinement.
So wrapping up, let's leave our listeners with something to think about, building on this idea. Here's a final provocative thought for you. We've seen the law, through Schmidt, excuse an act done under an insane delusion of divine command. Should the law, logically, also excuse an act performed under an equally powerful, equally sincere, but ultimately insane delusion of, say, overwhelming and irresistible political necessity? Where does that line get drawn? Something to mull over as you continue your own deep dive.